This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 22. The housemaid's folding back her window shutters at 8 o'clock the next day was the sound which first roused Catherine, and she opened her eyes, wondering that they could ever have been closed, on objects of cheerfulness. Her fire was already burning, and a bright morning had succeeded the tempest of the night. Instantaneously, with the consciousness of existence, returned her recollection of the manuscript, and springing from the bed in the very moment of the maid's going away, she eagerly collected every scattered sheet which had burst from the roll on its falling to the ground, and flew back to enjoy the luxury of their perusal on her pillow. She now plainly saw that she must not expect a manuscript of equal length with the generality of which she had shuddered over in books, for the roll, seeming to consist entirely of small disjointed sheets, was altogether but of trifling size, and much less than she had supposed it to be at first. Her greedy eye glanced rapidly over a page. She started at its import. Could it be possible? Or did not her senses play her false? An inventory of linen, in coarse and modern characters, seemed all that was before her. If the evidence of sight must be trusted, she held a washing bill in her hand. She seized another sheet, and saw the same articles with little variation. A third, a fourth, and a fifth presented nothing new. Shirts, stockings, cravats, and waistcoats faced her in each. Two others, penned by the same hand, marked an expenditure scarcely more interesting, in letters, hair powder, shoestring, and breeches ball. And the larger sheet, which had enclosed the rest, seemed by its first cramped line, "To Poultice Chestnut Mare," a farrier's bill. Such was the collection of papers, left perhaps, as she could then suppose, by the negligence of a servant in the place whence she had taken them, which had filled her with expectation and alarm, and robbed her of half her night's rest. She felt humbled to the dust. Could not the adventure of the chest have taught her wisdom? A corner of it, catching her eye as she lay, seemed to rise up in judgment against her. Nothing now could be clearer than the absurdity of her recent fancies. To suppose that a manuscript of many generations back could have remained undiscovered in a room such as that, so modern, so habitable, or that she should be the first to possess the skill of unlocking a cabinet, the key of which was open to all. How could she have so imposed on herself? Heaven forbid that Henry Tilney should ever know her folly. And it was in great measure his own doing, for had not the cabinet appeared so exactly to agree with his description of her adventures, she should never have felt the smallest curiosity about it. This was the only comfort that occurred. Impatient to get rid of those hateful evidences of her folly, those detestable papers then scattered over the bed, she rose directly, and folding them up as nearly as possible in the same shape as before, returned them to the same spot within the cabinet, with a very hearty wish that no untoward accident might ever bring them forward again to disgrace her even with herself. Why the lock should have been so difficult to open, however, was still something remarkable, for she could now manage them with perfect ease. In this there was surely something mysterious, and she indulged in the flattering suggestion for half a minute, till the possibility of the doors having been at first unlocked, and of herself being its fastener, darted into her head, and cost her another blush. She got away as soon as she could from a room in which her conduct produced such unpleasant reflections, and found her way with all speed to the breakfast parlour, as it had been pointed out to her by Miss Tilney the evening before. Henry was alone in it, and his immediate hope of her having been undisturbed by the tempest, with an arch reference to the character of the building they inhabited, was rather distressing. For the world she would not have her weakness suspected, and yet, unequal to an absolute falsehood, she was constrained to acknowledge that the wind had kept her awake a little. "But we have a charming morning after it," she added, desiring to get rid of the subject. "And storms and sleeplessness are nothing when they are over. What beautiful hyacinths! I have just learnt to love a hyacinth." "And how might you learn? By accident or argument?" "Your sister taught me, I cannot tell how. Mrs. Allen used to take pains, year after year, to make me like them, but I never could, till I saw them the other day at Milsom Street. I am naturally indifferent about flowers." "But now you love a hyacinth, so much the better. You have gained a new source of enjoyment, and it is well to have as many holds upon happiness as possible. Besides, a taste for flowers is always desirable in your sex, as a means of getting you out of doors, and tempting you to more frequent exercise than you would otherwise take. And though the love of a hyacinth may be rather domestic, who can tell, the sentiment once raised, but you may in time come to love a rose." But I do not want any such pursuit to get me out of doors. The pleasure of walking and breathing fresh air is enough for me, and in fine weather I am out more than half my time. Mamma says I am never within. At any rate, however, I am pleased that you have learned to love a hyacinth. The mere habit of learning to love is the thing, and a teachableness of disposition in a young lady is a great blessing. Has my sister a pleasant mode of instruction?" Catherine was saved the embarrassment of attempting an answer by the entrance of the General, whose smiling compliments announced a happy state of mind, but whose gentle hint of sympathetic early rising did not advance her composure. The elegance of the breakfast set forced itself on Catherine's notice when they were seated at table, and lucidly it had been the General's choice. He was enchanted by her approbation of his taste, confessed it to be neat and simple, thought it right to encourage the manufacture of his country, and for his part, to his uncritical palate, the tea was as well flavoured from the clay of Staffordshire as from that of Dresden or Savoy. But this was quite an old set, purchased 2 years ago. The manufacture was much improved since that time. He had seen some beautiful specimens when last in town, and had he not been perfectly without vanity of that kind, might have been tempted to order a new set. He trusted, however, that an opportunity might ere long occur of selecting one, though not for himself. Catherine was probably the only one of the party who did not understand him. Shortly after breakfast, Henry left them for Woodstones, where business required and would keep him 2 or 3 days. They all attended in the hall to see him mount his horse, and immediately on re-entering the breakfast-room, Catherine walked to a window, in the hope of catching another glimpse of his figure. "This is a somewhat heavy call on your brother's fortitude," observed the General to Elinor. "Woodstones would make but a sombre appearance to-day." "Is it a pretty place?" asked Catherine. "What say you, Elinor? Speak your opinion, for ladies can best tell the taste of ladies in regard to places, as well as men. I think it would be acknowledged by the most impartial eye to have many recommendations. The house stands among fine meadows facing the south-east, with an excellent kitchen garden in the same aspect, the walls surrounding which I built and stocked myself about 10 years ago for the benefit of my son. It's a family living, Miss Morland, and the property in the place being chiefly my own, you may believe I take care that it shall not be a bad one. Did Henry's income depend solely on this living, he would not be ill provided for. Perhaps it may seem odd that with only 2 younger children I should think any profession necessary for him, and certainly there are moments when we could all wish him disengaged from every tie of business. But though I may not exactly make converts of you young ladies, I am sure your father, Miss Morland, would agree with me in thinking it expedient to give every young man some employment. The money is nothing, it is not an object, but employment is the thing. Even Frederick, my eldest son, you see, who will perhaps inherit as considerable a landed property as any private man in the country, has his profession." The imposing effect of this last argument was equal to his wishes. The silence of the lady proved it to be unanswerable. Something had been said the evening before of her being shown over the house, and he now offered himself as her conductor, and though Catherine had hoped to explore it, accompanied only by his daughter, it was a proposal of too much happiness in itself, under any circumstances, not to be gladly accepted, for she had already been 18 hours in the Abbey, and had seen only a few of its rooms. The netting box, just leisurely drawn forth, was closed with joyful haste, and she was ready to attend him in a moment, and when they had gone over the house, he promised himself, moreover, the pleasure of accompanying her into the shrubberies and garden. She curtsied her acquiescence. "But perhaps it might be more agreeable to her to make those her first object. The weather was at present favourable, and at this time of year the uncertainty was very great of its continuing so. Which would she prefer? He was equally at her service. Which did his daughter think would most accord her friend's fair wishes? But he thought he could discern, yes, he certainly read in Miss Morland's eyes a judicious desire of making use of the present smiling weather. But when did she judge amiss? The Abbey would always be safe and dry. He yielded implicitly, and would fetch his hat and attend them in a moment." He left the room, and Catherine, with a disappointed, anxious face, began to speak of her unwillingness that he should be taking them out of doors against his own inclination, under a mistaken idea of pleasing her. But she was stopped by Miss Tilney's saying, with a little confusion, "I believe it will be wisest to take the morning while it is so fine, and do not be uneasy on my father's account. He always walks out this time of day." Catherine did not exactly know how this was to be understood. Why was Miss Tilney embarrassed? Could there be any unwillingness on the General's side to show her over the Abbey? The proposal was his own, and was it not odd that he should always take his walk so early? Neither her father nor Mr. Allen did so. It was certainly very provoking. She was all impatience to see the house, and had scarcely any curiosity about the grounds. If Henry had been with them, indeed, but now she should not know what was picturesque when she saw it. Such were her thoughts, but she kept them to herself, and put on her bonnet in patient discontent. She was struck, however, beyond her expectation by the grandeur of the Abbey, as she saw it for the first time from the lawn. The whole building enclosed a large court, and two sides of the quadrangle, rich in Gothic ornaments, stood forward for admiration. The remainder was shut off by knolls of old trees or luxurious plantations, and the steep woody hills rising behind to give it shelter were beautiful even in the leafless month of March. Catherine had seen nothing to compare with it, and her feelings of delight were so strong that without waiting for any better authority she boldly burst forth in wonder and praise. The General listened with assenting gratitude, and it seemed as if his own estimation of Northanger had waited unfixed till that hour. The kitchen garden was next to be admired, and he led the way to it across a small portion of the park. The number of acres contained in this garden was such as Catherine could not listen to without dismay, being more than double the extent of all Mr. Allen's, as well as her father's, including churchyard and orchard. The walls seemed countless in number, endless in length. A village of hothouses seemed to arise among them, and a whole parish to be at work within the enclosure. The General was flattered by her looks of surprise, which told him almost as plainly, as he soon forced her to tell him in words, that she had never seen any gardens at all equal to them before, and then he modestly owned that, without any ambition of that sort himself, without any solicitude about it, he did believe them to be unrivalled in the kingdom. If he had a hobby horse, it was that. He loved a garden. Though careless enough in most matters of eating, he loved good fruit, or if he did not, his friends and children did. There were great vexations, however, attending such a garden as his. The utmost care could not always secure the most valuable fruits. The pinery had yielded only 100 in the last year. Mr. Allen, he supposed, must feel these inconveniences as well as himself. No, not at all. Mr. Allen did not care about the garden, and never went into it. With a triumphant smile of self-satisfaction, the General wished he could do the same, for he never entered his without being vexed in some way or the other by its falling short of his plan. How were Mr. Allen's succession houses worked? Describing the nature of his own as they entered them. Mr. Allen had only one small hothouse, which Mrs. Allen had the use of for her plants in winter, and there was a fire in it now and then. He is a happy man, said the General, with a look of very happy contempt. Having taken her into every division, and led her under every wall till she was heartily weary of seeing and wondering, he suffered the girls at last to seize the advantage of an outer door, and then, expressing his wish to examine the effect of some recent alterations about the tea-house, proposed it as no unpleasant extension of their walk, if Miss Moreland were not tired. But where are you going, Eleanor? Why do you choose that cold, damp path to it? Miss Moreland will get wet. Our best way is across the park. This is so favourite a walk of mine, said Miss Tilney, that I always think it the best and nearest way, but perhaps it may be damp. It was a narrow winding path through a thick grove of old Scotch firs, and Catherine, struck by its gloomy aspect, and eager to enter it, could not, even by the General's disapprobation, be kept from stepping forward. He perceived her inclination, and having again urged the plea of health in vain, was too polite to make further opposition. He excused himself, however, from attending them. The rays of the sun were not too cheerful for him, and he would meet them by another course. He turned away, and Catherine was shocked to find how much her spirits were relieved by the separation. The shock, however, being less real than relief, offered it no injury, and she began to talk with easy gaiety of the delightful melancholy which such a grove inspired. "I'm particularly fond of this spot," said her companion, with a sigh. "It was my mother's favourite walk." Catherine had never heard Mrs. Tilney mentioned in the family before, and the interest excited by this tender remembrance showed itself directly in her altered countenance, and in the attentive pause with which she waited for something more. "I used to walk here so often with her," added Eleanor, "though I never loved it then, as I have loved it since. At that time, indeed, I used to wonder at her choice, but her memory endears it now." "And ought it not," reflected Catherine, "to endear it to her husband? Yet the General would not enter it." Miss Tilney, continuing silent, she ventured to say. "Her death must have been a great affliction." "A great and increasing one," replied the other in a low voice. "I was only 13 when it happened, and though I felt my loss perhaps as strongly as one so young could feel it, I could not then know what a loss it was." She stopped for a moment, and then added with great firmness, "I have no sister, you know, and though my brothers are very affectionate, and Henry is a great deal here, which I am most thankful for, it is impossible for me not to be often solitary." "To be sure, you must miss him very much." "A mother would have been always present. A mother would have been a constant friend. Her influence would have been beyond all other." "Was she a very charming woman? Was she handsome? Was there any picture of her in the Abbey? And why had she been so partial to that grove? Was it from the dejection of spirits?" were questions now eagerly poured forth. The first three received a ready affirmative. The other two were passed by, and Catherine's interest in the deceased Mrs. Tilney augmented with every question, whether answered or not. Of her unhappiness in marriage she felt persuaded. The General certainly had been an unkind husband. He did not let her walk. Could he therefore have loved her? And besides, handsome as he was, there was something in the turn of his features which spoke of his not having behaved well to her. "Her picture, I suppose," blushing at the consummate art of her own question, "hangs in your father's room?" "No, it was intended for the drawing-room, but my father was dissatisfied with the painting, and for some time it had no place. Soon after her death I obtained it for my own, and hung it in my bedchamber, where I should be happy to show you. It is very like." Here was another proof, a portrait very like of a departed wife, not valued by the husband. He must have been dreadfully cruel to her. Catherine attempted no longer to hide herself from the nature of the feelings which, in spite of all his attentions, he had previously excited, and what had been terror and dislike before was now absolute aversion. Yes, aversion. His cruelty to such a charming woman made him odious to her. She had often read of such characters which Mr. Allen had been used to call unnatural and overdrawn, but here was proof positive of the contrary. She had just settled this point when the end of the path brought them directly upon the General, and in spite of all her virtuous indignation, she found herself again obliged to walk with him, listen to him, and even to smile when he smiled. Being no longer able, however, to receive pleasure from the surrounding objects, she soon began to walk with lassitude. The General perceived it, and with concern for her health, which seemed to reproach her for her opinion of him, was most urgent for returning with his daughter to the house. He would follow them in a quarter of an hour. Again they parted, but Elinor was called back in half a minute to receive a strict charge against taking her friend round the Abbey till his return. This second instance of his anxiety to delay what she so much wished for struck Catherine as very remarkable. End of chapter 22. Read by Kristen McQuillan, Tokyo, Japan, November 24th, 2005. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 23. An hour passed away before the General came in, spent on the part of his young guest in no very favourable consideration of his character. This lengthened absence, these solitary rambles, did not speak a mind at ease or a conscience void of reproach. At length he appeared, and whatever might have been the gloom of his meditations, he could still smile with them. Miss Tilney, understanding in part her friend's curiosity to see the house, soon revived the subject, and her father being, contrary to Catherine's expectations, unprovided with any pretence for further delay, beyond that of stopping 5 minutes to order refreshments to be in the room on their return, was at last ready to escort them. They set forward, and with a grandeur of air, a dignified step which caught the eye but could not shake the doubts of the well-read Catherine, he led the way across the hall, through the common drawing-room and one useless antechamber, into a room magnificent both in size and furniture, the real drawing-room, used only with company of consequence. It was very noble, very grand, very charming, was all that Catherine had to say, for her indiscriminating eye scarcely discerned the colour of the satin, and all minuteness of praise, all praise that had much meaning, was supplied by the General. The costliness or elegance of any room's fitting up could be nothing to her. She cared for no furniture of a more modern date than the 15th century. When the General had satisfied his own curiosity in a close examination of every well-known ornament, they proceeded into the library, an apartment in its way of equal magnificence,
exhibiting a collection of books, on which an humble man might have looked with pride. Catherine heard, admired, and wondered with more genuine feeling than before, and gathered all that she could from this storehouse of knowledge by running over the titles of half a shelf, and was ready to proceed. But suites of apartments did not spring up with her wishes. Large as was the building, she had already visited the greatest part, though on being told that, with the addition of the kitchen, the 6 or 7 rooms she had now seen surrounded 3 sides of the court, she could scarcely believe it, or overcome the suspicion of there being many chambers secreted. It was some relief, however, that they were to return to the rooms in common use by passing through a few of less importance, looking into the court, which, with occasional passages not wholly unintricate, connected the different sides, and she was further soothed in her progress by being told that she was treading what had once been a cloister, having traces of cells pointed out, and observing several doors that were neither opened nor explained to her. By finding herself successively in a billiard-room and in the General's private apartment without comprehending their connection, or being able to turn aright when she left them. And lastly, by passing through a dark little room, owning Henry's authority, and strewed with his litter of books, guns, and greatcoats. From the dining-room, of which, though already seen, and always to be seen at 5 o'clock, the General could not forego the pleasure of pacing out the length, for the more certain information of Miss Moreland, as to which she neither doubted nor cared for. They proceeded by quick communication to the kitchen, the ancient kitchen of the convent, rich in massy walls and smoke of former days, and in the stoves and hot closets of the present. The General's improving hand had not loitered here. Every modern invention to facilitate the labour of cooks had been adopted within this their spacious theatre, and when the genius of others had failed, his own had often produced the perfection wanted. His endowments on this spot alone might at any time have placed him high among the benefactors of the convent. With the walls of the kitchen ended all the antiquity of the Abbey, the 4th side of the quadrangle having, on account of its decaying state, been removed by the General's father, and the present erected in its place. All that was venerable ceased here. The new building was not only new, but declared itself to be so, intended only for offices, and enclosed behind by stable yards. No uniformity of architecture had been thought necessary. Catherine could have raved at the hand which had swept away what must have been beyond the value of all the rest, for the purposes of mere domestic economy, and would willingly have been spared the mortification of a walk-through scene so fallen had the General allowed it. But if he had a vanity, it was in the arrangement of his offices, and as he was convinced that, to a mind like Miss Moreland's, a view of the accommodations and comforts by which the labours of her inferiors were softened must always be gratifying, he should make no apology for leading her on. They took a slight survey of all, and Catherine was impressed beyond her expectation by their multiplicity and their convenience. The purposes for which a few shapeless pantries and a comfortless scullery were deemed sufficient at Fullerton, here were carried on in appropriate divisions, commodious and roomy. The number of servants continually appearing did not strike her less than the number of their offices. Wherever they went, some patented girl stopped to curtsy, or some footman in dishabille sneaked off. Yet this was an abbey. How inexpressibly different in these domestic arrangements from such she had read about, from abbeys and castles in which, though certainly larger than Northanger, all the dirty work of the house was to be done by 2 pair of female hands at the utmost. How they could get through it all had often amazed Mrs. Allen, and when Catherine saw it was necessary here, she began to be amazed herself. They returned to the hall, that the chief staircase might be ascended, and the beauty of its wood and ornaments of rich carving might be pointed out. Having gained the top, they turned in an opposite direction from the gallery in which her room lay, and shortly entered one in the same plan, but superior in length and breadth. Here she was shown successively into 3 large bedchambers, with their dressing-rooms most completely and handsomely fitted up. Everything that money and taste could do to give comfort and elegance to apartments had been bestowed on these, and being furnished within the last 5 years, they were perfect in all that would be generally pleasing, and wanting in all that could give pleasure to Catherine. As they were surveying the last, the General, after slightly naming a few of the distinguished characters by whom they had at times been honoured, turned with a smiling countenance to Catherine, and ventured to hope that henceforward some of their earliest tenants might be our friends from Fullerton. She felt the unexpected compliment, and deeply regretted the impossibility of thinking well of a man so kindly disposed towards herself, and so full of civility to all her family. The gallery was terminated by folding doors, which Miss Tilney, advancing, had thrown open, and passed through, and seemed on the point of doing the same to the first door to the left, in another long reach of gallery, when the General, coming forwards, called her hastily, and, as Catherine thought, rather angrily, back, demanding whither she were going, and what more was there to be seen? Had not Miss Moreland already seen all that could be worth her notice? And did she not suppose her friend might be glad of some refreshment after so much exercise? Miss Tilney drew back directly, and the heavy doors were closed upon the mortified Catherine, who, having seen in a momentary glance beyond them a narrower passage, more numerous openings, and symptoms of a winding staircase, believed herself at last within the reach of something worth her notice, and felt, as she unwillingly paced back the gallery, that she would rather be allowed to examine that end of the house than to see all the finery of all the rest. The General's evident desire of preventing such an examination was an additional stimulant. Something was certainly to be concealed. Her fancy, though it had trespassed lately once or twice, could not mislead her here, and what that something was, a short sentence of Miss Tilney's as they followed the General at some distance downstairs seemed to point out. "I was going to take you into what was my mother's room, the room in which she died," were all her words. But few as they were, they conveyed pages of intelligence to Catherine. It was no wonder that the General should shrink from the sight of such objects as that room must contain, a room in all probability never entered by him since the dreadful scene had passed, which released his suffering wife and left him to the stings of conscience. She ventured, when next alone with Elinor, to express her wish of being permitted to see it, as well as all the rest of that side of the house, and Elinor promised to attend her there whenever they should have a convenient hour. Catherine understood her. The General must be watched from home before that room could be entered. "It remains as it was, I suppose," she said in a tone of feeling. "Yes, entirely." "And how long ago may it be that your mother died?" "She's been dead these 9 years." And 9 years, Catherine knew, was a trifle of time compared with what generally elapsed after the death of an injured wife, before her room was put to rights. "You were with her, I suppose, to the last?" "No," said Miss Tilney, sighing. "I was unfortunately from home. Her illness was sudden and short, and before I arrived it was all over." Catherine's blood ran cold with the horrid suggestions which naturally sprang from these words. Could it be possible? Could Henry's father? And yet how many were the examples to justify even the blackest suspicions? And when she saw him in the evening, while she worked with her friend, slowly pacing the drawing-room for an hour together in silent thoughtfulness, with downcast eyes and contracted brow, she felt secure from all possibility of wronging him. It was the air and attitude of Montoni. What could more plainly speak the gloomy workings of a mind not wholly dead to every sense of humanity, in its fearful review of past scenes of guilt? Unhappy man! And the anxiousness of her spirits directed her eyes towards his figure so repeatedly as to catch Miss Tilney's notice. "My father," she whispered, "often walks about the room this way. It is nothing unusual." So much the worse, thought Catherine. Such ill-timed exercise was of a piece with the strange unseasonableness of his morning walks, and boded nothing good. After an evening, the little variety and seeming length of which made her peculiarly sensible of Henry's importance among them, she was heartily glad to be dismissed, though it was a look from the General, not designed for her observation, which sent his daughter to the bell. When the butler would have lit his master's candle, however, he was forbidden. The latter was not going to retire. "I have many pamphlets to finish," he said to Catherine, "before I can close my eyes, and perhaps may be poring over the affairs of the nation for hours after you are asleep. Can either of us be more meetly employed? My eyes will be blinding for the good of others, yours preparing by rest for future mischief." But neither the business alleged nor the magnificent compliment could win Catherine from thinking that some very different object must occasion so serious a delay of proper repose. To be kept up for hours, after the family were in bed, by stupid pamphlets was not very likely. There must be some deeper cause, Something was to be done which could be done only while the household slept, and the probability that Mrs. Tilney yet lived, shut up for causes unknown, and receiving from the pitiless hands of her husband a nightly supply of coarse food, was the conclusion which necessarily followed. Shocking as was the idea, it was at least better than a death unfairly hastened, as in the natural course of things she must ere long be released. The suddenness of her reputed illness, the absence of her daughter, and probably of her other children at the time, all favoured the supposition of her imprisonment. Its origin, jealousy perhaps, or wanton cruelty, was yet to be unravelled. In revolving these matters while she undressed, it suddenly struck her as not unlikely that she might that morning have passed near the very spot of this unfortunate woman's confinement, might have been within a few paces of the cell in which she languished out her days. For what part of the Abbey could be more fitted for the purpose than that which yet bore the traces of monastic division? In the high arched passage paved with stone, which she had already trodden with peculiar awe, she well remembered the doors of which the general had given no account. To what might not those doors lead? In support of the plausibility of this conjecture, it further occurred to her that the forbidden gallery, in which lay the apartments of the unfortunate Mrs. Tilney, must be, as certainly as her memory could guide her, exactly over this suspected range of cells, and the staircase by the side of those apartments of which she had caught a transient glimpse, communicating by some secret means with those cells, might well have favoured the barbarous proceedings of her husband. Down that staircase she had perhaps been conveyed in a state of well-prepared insensibility. Catherine sometimes started at the boldness of her own surmises, and sometimes hoped or feared that she had gone too far, but they were supported by such appearances as made their dismissal impossible. The side of the quadrangle in which she supposed the guilty scene to be acting being, according to her belief, just opposite her own, it struck her that, if judiciously watched, some rays of light from the general's lamp might glimmer through the lower windows as he passed to the prison of his wife, and twice before she stepped into bed she stole gently from her room to the corresponding window in the gallery to see if it appeared, but all abroad was dark, and it must yet be too early. The various ascending noises convinced her that the servants must still be up. Till midnight she supposed it would be in vain to watch, but then, when the clock had struck 12 and all was quiet, she would, if not quite appalled by the darkness, steal out and look once more. The clock struck 12, and Catherine had been half an hour asleep. End of chapter 23. Read by Kristen McQuillan, Tokyo, Japan, February 8th, 2005. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 24. The next day afforded no opportunity for the proposed examination of the mysterious apartments. It was Sunday, and the whole time between morning and afternoon service was required by the general an exercise abroad or eating cold meat at home, and great as was Catherine's curiosity, her courage was not equal to a wish of exploring them after dinner, either by the fading light of the sky between 6 and 7 o'clock, or by the yet more partial though stronger illumination of a treacherous lamp. The day was unmarked, therefore, by anything to interest her imagination beyond the sight of a very elegant monument to the memory of Mrs. Tilney, which immediately fronted the family pew. By that her eye was instantly caught and long retained, and the perusal of the highly strained epitaph, in which every virtue was ascribed to her by the inconsolable husband, who must have been in some way or other her destroyer, affected her even to tears. That the general, having erected such a monument, should be able to face it, was not perhaps very strange, and yet that he could sit so boldly collected within its view, maintain so elevated an air, look so fearlessly around, nay, that he should even enter the church, seemed wonderful to Catherine. Not, however, that many instances of beings equally hardened in guilt might not be produced. She could remember dozens who had persevered in every possible vice, going on from crime to crime, murdering whomsoever they chose, without any feeling of humanity or remorse, till a violent death or a religious retirement closed their black career. The erection of the monument itself could not in the smallest degree affect her doubts of Mrs. Tilney's actual decease. Were she even to descend into the family vault where her ashes were supposed to slumber? Were she to behold the coffin in which they were said to be enclosed? What could it avail in such a case? Catherine had read too much not to be perfectly aware of the ease with which a waxen figure might be introduced, and a supposititious funeral carried on. The succeeding morning promised something better. The General's early walk, ill-timed as it was in every other view, was favourable here, and when she knew him to be out of the house, she directly proposed to Miss Tilney the accomplishment of her promise. Elinor was ready to oblige her, and Catherine, reminding her as they went of another promise, their first visit in consequence was to the portrait in her bedchamber. It represented a very lovely woman, with a mild and pensive countenance, justifying, so far, the expectations of its new observer, but they were not in every respect answered, for Catherine had depended upon meeting with features, hair, complexion, that should be the very counterpart, the very image, if not of Henry's, of Elinor's, the only portraits of which she had been in the habit of thinking bearing always an equal resemblance of mother and child. A face once taken was taken for generations. But here she was obliged to look and consider and study for a likeness. She contemplated it, however, in spite of this drawback, with much emotion, and but for a yet stronger interest would have left it unwillingly. Her agitation as they entered the great gallery was too much for any endeavour at discourse. She could only look at her companion. Elinor's countenance was dejected yet sedate, and its composure spoke her inured to all the gloomy objects to which they were advancing. Again she passed through the folding doors, again her hand was on the important lock, and Catherine, hardly able to breathe, was turning to close the former with fearful caution, when the figure, the dreaded figure of the General himself at the further end of the gallery stood before her. The name of Elinor, at the same moment, in its loudest tone, resounded through the building, giving to his daughter the first intimation of his presence, and to Catherine terror upon terror. An attempt at concealment had been her first instinctive movement on perceiving him, yet she could scarcely hope to have escaped his eye, and when her friend, who with an apologizing look darted hastily by her and joined and disappeared with him, she ran for safety to her own room, and locking herself in, believed she should never have courage to go down again. She remained there at least an hour, in the greatest agitation, deeply commiserating the state of her poor friend, and expecting a summons herself from the angry General to attend him in his own apartment. No summons, however, arrived, and at last, on seeing a carriage drive up to the Abbey, she was emboldened to descend and meet him under the protection of visitors. The breakfast-room was gay with company, and she was named to them by the General as the friend of his daughter, in a complimentary style, which so well concealed his resentful ire as to make her feel secure at least of life for the present. And Elinor, with a command of countenance which did honour to her concern for his character, taking an early occasion of saying to her, "My father only wanted me to answer a note," and she began to hope that she had either been unseen by the General, or that from some consideration of policy she should be allowed to suppose herself so. Upon this trust she dared still to remain in his presence after the company left them, and nothing occurred to disturb it. In the course of this morning's reflections she came to a resolution of making her next attempt on the forbidden door alone. It would be much better in every respect that Elinor should know nothing of the matter. To involve her in the danger of a second detection, to court her into an apartment which must wring her heart, could not be the office of a friend. The General's utmost anger could not be to herself what it might be to a daughter, and besides, she thought the examination itself would be more satisfactory if made without any companion. It would be impossible to explain to Elinor the suspicions from which the other had, in all likelihood, been hitherto happily exempt. Nor could she therefore, in her presence, search for those proofs of the General's cruelty, which, however they might yet have escaped discovery, she felt confident of somewhere drawing forth in the shape of some fragmented journal continued to the last gasp. Of the way to the apartment she was now perfectly mistress, and as she wished to get it over before Henry's return, who was expected on the morrow, there was no time to be lost. The day was bright, her courage high. At 4 o'clock the sun was now 2 hours above the horizon, and it would only be her retiring to dress half an hour earlier than usual. It was done, and Catherine found herself alone in the gallery before the clocks had ceased to strike. It was no time for thought. She hurried on, slipped with the least possible noise through the folding doors, and without stopping to look or breathe, rushed forward to the one in question. The lock yielded to her hand, and luckily with no sullen sound that could alarm a human being. On tiptoe she entered. The room was before her, but it was some minutes before she could advance another step. She beheld what fixed her to the spot and agitated every feature. She saw a large, well-proportioned apartment, a handsome dimity bed, arranged as unoccupied with a housemaid's care, a bright bath stove, mahogany wardrobes, and neatly painted chairs, on which the warm beams of a western sun gaily poured through two sash windows. Catherine had expected to have her feelings worked, and worked they were. Astonishment and doubt first seized them, and a shortly succeeding ray of common sense added some bitter emotions of shame. She could not be mistaken as to the room, but how grossly mistaken in everything else! In Miss Tilney's meaning, in her own calculation, this apartment, to which she had given a date so ancient, a position so awful, proved to be one end of what the General's father had built. There were two other doors in the chamber, leading probably into dressing-closets, but she had no inclination to open either. Would the veil in which Mrs. Tilney had last walked, or the volume in which she had last read, remain to tell what nothing else was allowed to whisper? No, whatever might have been the General's crimes, he had certainly too much wit to let them sue for detection. She was sick of exploring, and desired but to be safe in her own room, with her own heart only privy to its folly, and she was on the point of retreating as softly as she had entered, when the sound of footsteps, she could hardly tell where, made her pause and tremble. To be found there, even by a servant, would be unpleasant, but by the General, and he seemed always at hand when least wanted, much worse. She listened. The sound had ceased, and resolving not to lose a moment, she passed through and closed the door. At that instant a door underneath was hastily opened. Someone seemed with swift steps to ascend the stairs, by the head of which she had yet to pass before she could gain the gallery. She had no power to move. With a feeling of terror not very definable, she fixed her eyes on the staircase, and in a few moments it gave Henry to her view. "Mr. Tilney!" she exclaimed in a voice of more than common astonishment. He looked astonished too. "Good God!" she continued, not attending to his address. "How came you here? How came you up that staircase?" "How came I up that staircase?" he replied, greatly surprised. "Because it is my nearest way from the stable-yard to my own chamber. And why should I not come up it?" Catherine recollected herself, blushed deeply, and could say no more. He seemed to be looking in her countenance for that explanation which her lips did not afford. She moved on toward the gallery. "And may I not, in my turn," he said, as he pushed back the folding doors, "ask how you came here? This passage is at least as extraordinary a road from the breakfast parlour to your apartment as that staircase can be from the stables to mine." "I have been," said Catherine, looking down, "to see your mother's room." "My mother's room? Is there anything extraordinary to be seen there?" "No, nothing at all. I thought you did not mean to come back till to-morrow." "I did not expect to be able to return sooner when I went away, but 3 hours ago I had the pleasure of finding nothing to detain me." "You look pale." "I'm afraid I alarmed you by running so fast up those stairs. Perhaps you did not know. You were not aware of their leading from the offices in common use." "No, I was not. You've had a very fine day for your ride." "Very. And does Elinor leave you to find your way into all the rooms in the house by yourself?" "Oh, no, she showed me over the greatest part on Saturday, and we were coming here to these rooms, but only—" she dropped her voice. "Your father was with us." "And that prevented you?" said Henry, earnestly regarding her. "Have you looked into all the rooms in that passage?" "No, I only wanted to see— Is it not very late? I must go and dress." "It is only 4:15, showing his watch, "and you are not now in Bath. No theatres, no rooms to prepare for. Half an hour at Northanger must be enough." She could not contradict it, and therefore suffered herself to be detained, though her dread of further questions made her, for the first time in their acquaintance, wish to leave him. They walked slowly up the gallery. "Have you had any letter from Bath since I saw you?" "No, and I'm very much surprised. Isabella promised so faithfully to write directly." "Promised so faithfully? A faithful promise? That puzzles me. I've heard of a faithful performance, but a faithful promise? The fidelity of promising! It's a power little worth knowing, however, since it can deceive and pain you. My mother's room is very commodious, is it not? Large and cheerful looking, and the dressing closet so well disposed. It always strikes me as the most comfortable apartment in the house, and I rather wonder that Elinor should not take it for her own. She sent you to look at it, I suppose?" "No." "It has been your own doing entirely?" Catherine said nothing. After a short silence, during which he had closely observed her, he added, "As there is nothing in the room itself to raise curiosity, this must have proceeded from a sentiment of respect for my mother's character, as described by Elinor, which does honour to her memory. The world, I believe, never saw a better woman, but it is not often that virtue can boast an interest such as this. The domestic, unpretending merits of a person never known do not often create that kind of fervent, venerating tenderness which would prompt a visit like yours. Elinor, I suppose, has talked of her a great deal." "Yes, a great deal. That is, no, not much. But what she did say was very interesting. Her dying so suddenly." Slowly and with hesitation it was spoken. "And you, none of you being at home, and your father, I thought perhaps he had not been very fond of her." "And from these circumstances," he replied, his quick eye fixed on hers, "you infer perhaps the probability of some negligence, some—" Involuntarily she shook her head. "Or it may be of something still less pardonable." She raised her eyes toward him more fully than she had ever done before. "My mother's illness," he continued, "the seizure of which ended in her death, was sudden. The malady itself, one from which she had often suffered, a bilious fever, its cause therefore constitutional. On the third day, in short, as soon as she could be prevailed on, a physician attended her, a very respectable man, and one in whom she had always placed great confidence. Upon his opinion of her danger, 2 others were called in the next day, and remained in almost constant attendance for 24 hours. On the 5th day she died. During the progress of her disorder, Frederick and I, we were both at home, saw her repeatedly, and from our own observations can bear witness to her having received every possible attention which could spring from the affection of those about her, or which her situation in life could command. Poor Elinor was absent, and at such a distance as to return only to see her mother in her coffin." "But your father," said Catherine, "was he afflicted?" "For a time greatly so. You have erred in supposing him not attached to her. He loved her, I'm persuaded, as well as it was possible for him to. We have not all, you know, the same tenderness of disposition, and I will not pretend to say that while she lived she might not often have had much to bear, but though his temper injured her, his judgment never did. His value of her was sincere, and if not permanently, he was truly afflicted by her death." "I'm very glad of it," said Catherine. "It would have been very shocking." "If I understand you rightly, you had formed a surmise of such horror as I have hardly words to— Dear Miss Moreland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you've entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember the country and age in which we live. Remember that we are English, we are Christians. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighbourhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dearest Miss Moreland, what ideas have you been admitting?" They had reached the end of the gallery, and with tears of shame she ran off to her own room. End of Chapter 24. Read by Kristen McQuillan, Tokyo, Japan, February 8th, 2006.
Recorded by Vicky Barber, St. John's, Newfoundland, February 2006. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Chapter 25. The visions of romance were over. Catherine was completely awakened. Henry's address, short as it had been, had more thoroughly opened her eyes to the extravagance of her late fancies than all their several disappointments had done. Most grievously she was humbled. Most bitterly did she cry. It was not only with herself that she was sunk, but with Henry. Her folly, which now seemed even criminal, was all exposed to him, and he must despise her forever. The liberty which her imagination had dared to take with the character of his father, could he ever forgive it? The absurdity of her curiosity and her fears, could they ever be forgotten? She hated herself more than she could express. She thought he had, once or twice before this fatal morning, shown something like affection for her. But now, in short, she made herself as miserable as possible for about half an hour, went down when the clock struck 5, with a broken heart, and could scarcely give an intelligible answer to Eleanor's inquiry if she was well. The formidable Henry soon followed her into the room, and the only difference in his behavior to her was that he paid her rather more attention than usual. Catherine had never wanted comfort more, and he looked as if he was aware of it. The evening wore away with no abatement of this soothing politeness, and her spirits were gradually raised to a modest tranquillity. She did not learn either to forget or defend the past, but she learned to hope that it would never transpire farther, and that it might not cost her Henry's entire regard. Her thoughts being still chiefly fixed on what she had, with such causeless terror, felt and done, nothing could shortly be clearer than that it had been all a voluntary, self-created delusion, each trifling circumstance receiving importance from an imagination resolved on alarm, and everything forced to bend to one purpose by a mind which, before she entered the Abbey, had been craving to be frightened. She remembered with what feelings she had prepared for a knowledge of Northanger. She saw that the infatuation had been created, the mischief settled, long before her quitting Bath, and it seemed as if the whole might be traced to the influence of that sort of reading which she had there indulged. Charming as were all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and charming even as were the works of all her imitators, it was not in them, perhaps, that human nature, at least in the Midland counties of England, was to be looked for. Of the Alps and Pyrenees, with their pine forests and their vices, they might give a faithful delineation, and Italy, Switzerland, and the south of France might be as fruitful in horrors as they were there represented. Catherine dared not doubt beyond her own country, and even of that, if hard-pressed, would have yielded the northern and western extremities. But in the central part of England there was surely some security for the existence even of a wife not beloved, in the laws of the land and the manners of the age. Murder was not tolerated, servants were not slaves, and neither poison nor sleeping potions to be procured, like rhubarb, from every druggist. Among the Alps and the Pyrenees, perhaps, there were no mixed characters. There, such as were not as spotless as an angel might have the dispositions of a fiend, but in England it was not so. Among the English, she believed, in their hearts and habits, there was a general, though unequal, mixture of good and bad. Upon this conviction she would not be surprised if even in Henry and Eleanor Tilney some slight imperfection might hereafter appear, and upon this conviction she need not fear to acknowledge some actual specks in the character of their father, who, though cleared from the grossly injurious suspicions which she must ever blush to have entertained, she did believe, upon serious consideration, to be not perfectly amiable. Her mind made up on these several points, and her resolution formed, of always judging and acting in future with the greatest good sense, she had nothing to do but to forgive herself, and be happier than ever. And the lenient hand of time did much for her, by insensible gradations in the course of another day. Henry's astonishing generosity and nobleness of conduct, in never alluding in the slightest way to what had passed, was of the greatest assistance to her. And sooner than she could have supposed it possible in the beginning of her distress, her spirits became absolutely comfortable and capable, as hitherto of continual improvement by anything he said. There were still some subjects, indeed, under which she believed they must always tremble, the mention of a chest or a cabinet, for instance, and she did not love the sight of Japan in any shape. But even she could allow that an occasional memento of past folly, however painful, might not be without use. The anxieties of common life began soon to succeed to the alarms of romance. Her desire of hearing from Isabella grew every day greater. She was quite impatient to know how the Bath world went on, and how the rooms were attended, and especially was she anxious to be assured of Isabella's having matched some fine netting cotton, on which she had left her intent, and of her continuing on the best terms with James. Her only dependence for information of any kind was on Isabella. James had protested against writing to her till his return to Oxford, and Mrs. Allen had given her no hopes of a letter till she had got back to Fullerton. But Isabella had promised and promised again, and when she promised a thing, she was so scrupulous in performing it. This made it so particularly strange. For 9 successive mornings, Catherine wondered over the repetition of a disappointment, which each morning became more severe. But on the 10th, when she entered the breakfast-room, her first object was a letter, held out by Henry's willing hand. She thanked him as heartily as if he had written it himself. "'Tis only from James, however." As she looked at the direction, she opened it. It was from Oxford, and to this purpose: "Dear Catherine, though God knows, with little inclination for writing, I think it my duty to tell you that everything is at an end between Miss Thorpe and me. I left her and Bath yesterday, never to see either again. I shall not enter into particulars. They would only pain you more. You will soon hear enough from another quarter to know where lies the blame, and I hope you will acquit your brother of everything but the folly of too easily thinking his affection returned. Thank God, I am undeceived in time. But it is a heavy blow, after my father's consent had been so kindly given. But no more of this. She has made me miserable forever. Let me soon hear from you, dear Catherine. You are my only friend. Your love I do build upon. I wish your visit at Northanger may be over before Captain Tilney makes his engagement known, or you will be uncomfortably circumstanced. Poor Thorpe is in town. I dread the sight of him. His honest heart would feel so much. I have written to him and my father. Her duplicity hurts me more than all. Till the very last, if I reasoned with her, she declared herself as much attached to me as ever, and I laughed at my fears. I am ashamed to think how long I bore with it, but if ever man had reason to believe himself loved, I was that man. I cannot understand even now what she would be at, for there could be no need of my being played off to make her secure of Tilney. We parted at last by mutual consent. Happy for me had we never met. I can never expect to know another woman. Dearest Catherine, beware how you give your heart. Believe me." Catherine had not read 3 lines before her sudden change of countenance and short exclamations of sorrowing wonder declared her to be receiving unpleasant news, and Henry, earnestly watching her through the whole letter, saw plainly that it ended no better than it began. He was prevented, however, from even looking his surprise by his father's entrance. They went to breakfast directly, but Catherine could hardly eat anything. Tears filled her eyes and even ran down her cheeks as she sat. The letter was one moment in her hand, then in her lap, and then in her pocket, and she looked as if she knew not what she did. The General, between his cocoa and his newspaper, had luckily no leisure for noticing her, but to the other 2 her distress was equally visible. As soon as she dared leave the table, she hurried away to her own room, but the housemaids were busy in it, and she was obliged to come down again. She turned into the drawing-room for privacy, but Henry and Eleanor had likewise retreated thither, and were at that moment deep in consultation about her. She drew back, trying to beg their pardon, but was, with gentle violence, forced to return, and the others withdrew, after Elinor had affectionately expressed a wish of being of use or comfort to her. After half an hour's free indulgence of grief and reflection, Catherine felt equal to encountering her friends, but whether she should make her distress known to them was another consideration. Perhaps, if particularly questioned, she might just give an idea, just distantly hint at it, but not more. To expose a friend, such a friend as Isabella had been to her, and then their own brother so closely concerned in it, she believed she must waive the subject altogether. Henry and Elinor were by themselves in the breakfast-room, and each, as she entered it, looked at her anxiously. Catherine took her place at the table, and after a short silence, Elinor said, "No bad news from Fullerton, I hope. Mr. and Mrs. Morland, your brothers and sisters, I hope they are none of them ill." "No, I thank you," sighing as she spoke. "They are all very well. My letter was from my brother at Oxford." Nothing further was said for a few minutes, and then, speaking through her tears, she added, "I do not think I shall ever wish for a letter again." "I am sorry," said Henry, closing the book he had just opened. "If I had suspected the letter of containing anything unwelcome, I should have given it with very different feelings. It contains something worse than anybody could suppose. Poor James is so unhappy. You will soon know why." "To have so kind-hearted, so affectionate a sister," replied Henry warmly, "must be a comfort to him under any distress." "I have one favor to beg," said Catherine shortly afterwards, in an agitated manner, "that, if your brother should be coming here, you will give me notice of it, that I may go away." "Our brother? Frederick?" "Yes. I am sure I should be very sorry to leave you so soon, but something has happened that would make it very dreadful for me to be in the same house with Captain Tilney." Elinor's work was suspended while she gazed with increasing astonishment, but Henry began to suspect the truth, and something, in which Miss Thorpe's name was included, passed his lips. "How quick you are!" cried Catherine. "You have guessed it, I declare. And yet, when we talked about it in Bath, you little thought of its ending so. Isabella, no wonder now I have not heard from her. Isabella has deserted my brother, and is to marry yours. Could you have believed there had been such inconsistency and fickleness, and everything that is bad in the world? I hope, so far as concerns my brother, you are misinformed. I hope he has not had any material share in bringing on Mr. Morland's disappointment. His marrying Miss Thorpe is not probable. I think you must be deceived so far. I am very sorry for Mr. Morland, sorry that anyone you love should be unhappy, but my surprise would be greater at Frederick's marrying her than at any other part of the story. It is very true, however. You shall read James's letter yourself. Stay, there is one part," recollecting with a blush the last line. "Will you take the trouble of reading to us the passages which concern my brother?" "No, read it yourself," cried Catherine, whose second thoughts were clearer. "I do not know what I was thinking of," blushing again that she had blushed before. "James only means to give me good advice." He gladly received the letter, and having read it through, with close attention, returned it, saying, "Well, if it is to be so, I can only say that I am sorry for it. Frederick will not be the first man who has chosen a wife with less sense than his family expected. I do not envy his situation, either as a lover or a son." Miss Tilney, at Catherine's invitation, now read the letter likewise, and having expressed also her concern and surprise, began to inquire into Miss Thorpe's connections and fortune. "Her mother is a very good sort of woman," was Catherine's answer. "What was her father?" "A lawyer, I believe. They live at Putney." "Are they a wealthy family?" "No, not very. I do not believe Isabella has any fortune at all, but that will not signify in your family. Your father is so very liberal. He told me the other day that he only valued money as it allowed him to promote the happiness of his children." The brother and sister looked at each other. "But," said Elinor after a short pause, "would it be to promote his happiness, to enable him to marry such a girl? She must be an unprincipled one, or she could not have used your brother so. And how strange an infatuation on Frederick's side! A girl who before his eyes is violating an engagement involuntarily entered into with another man. Is it not inconceivable, Henry? Frederick, too, who always wore his heart so proudly, who found no woman good enough to be loved. That is the most uncompromising circumstance, the strongest presumption against him. When I think of his past declarations, I give him up. Moreover, I have too good an opinion of Miss Thorpe's prudence to suppose that she would part with one gentleman before the other was secured. It is all over with Frederick indeed. He is a deceased man, defunct in understanding. Prepare for your sister-in-law, Elinor, and such a sister-in-law as you must delight in, open, candid, artless, guileless, with affections strong but simple, forming no pretensions, and knowing no disguise." "Such a sister-in-law, Henry, I should delight in," said Elinor with a smile. "But perhaps," observed Catherine, "though she has behaved so ill by our family, she may behave better by yours. Now she has really got the man she likes, she may be constant." "Indeed, I am afraid she will," replied Henry. "I am afraid she will be very constant, unless a baronet should come in her way. That is Frederick's only chance. I will get the Bath paper and look over the arrivals." "You think it is all for ambition, then? And upon my word there are some things that seem very like it. I cannot forget that when she first knew what my father would do for them, she seemed quite disappointed that it was not more. I never was so deceived in anyone's character in my life before, among all the great variety that you have known and studied. My own disappointment and loss in her is very great, but as for poor James, I suppose he will hardly ever recover it. Your brother is certainly very much to be pitied at present, but we must not, in our concern for his sufferings, undervalue yours. You feel, I suppose, that in losing Isabella, you lose half yourself. You feel a void in your heart which nothing else can occupy. Society is becoming irksome, and as for the amusements in which you were wont to share at Bath, the very idea of them without her is abhorrent. You would not, for instance, now go to a ball for the world. You feel that you have no longer any friend to whom you can speak with unreserve, on whose regard you can place dependence, or whose counsel, in any difficulty, you could rely on. You feel all this?" "No," said Catherine after a few moments' reflection. "I do not. Ought I? To say the truth, though I am hurt and grieved that I cannot still love her, that I am never to hear from her, perhaps never to see her again, I do not feel so very, very much afflicted as one would have thought. You feel, as you always do, what is most to the credit of human nature. Such feelings ought to be investigated, that they may know themselves. Catherine, by some chance or other, found her spirits so very much relieved by this conversation that she could not regret her being led on, though so unaccountably, to mention the circumstance which had produced it. End of chapter 25.
Recorded by Beth Dudek. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 26. From this time the subject was frequently canvassed by the three young people, and Catherine found, with some surprise, that her two young friends were perfectly agreed in considering Isabella's want of consequence and fortune as likely to throw great difficulties in the way of her marrying their brother. Their persuasion that the General would, upon this ground alone, independent of the objection that might be raised against her character, oppose the connection, turned her feelings moreover with some alarm towards herself. She was as insignificant and perhaps as portionless as Isabella, and if the heir of the Tilney property had not grandeur and wealth enough in himself, At what point of interest were the demands of his younger brother to rest? The very painful reflections to which this thought led could only be dispersed by a dependence on the effect of that particular partiality, which, as she was given to understand by his words as well as his actions, she had from the first been so fortunate as to excite in the general, and by a recollection of some most generous and disinterested sentiments on the subject of money, which she had more than once heard him utter, and which tempted her to think his disposition in such matters misunderstood by his children. They were so fully convinced, however, that their brother would not have the courage to apply in person for his father's consent, and so repeatedly assured her that he had never in his life been less likely to commit to Northanger than at the present time, that she suffered her mind to be at ease as to the necessity of any sudden removal of her own. But as it was not to be supposed that Captain Tilney, whenever he made his application, would give his father any just idea of Isabella's conduct, it occurred to her as highly expedient that Henry should lay the whole business before him as it really was, enabling the general by that means to form a cool and impartial opinion, and prepare his objections on a fairer ground than equality of situations. She proposed it to him accordingly, but he did not catch at the measure so eagerly as she had expected. "No," said he, "my father's hands need not be strengthened, and Frederick's confession of folly need not be forestalled. He must tell his own story." "But he will tell only half of it." "A quarter would be enough." A day or two passed away and brought no tidings of Captain Tilney. His brother and sister knew not what to think. Sometimes it appeared to them as if his silence would be the natural result of the suspected engagement, and at others that it was wholly incompatible with it. The general, meanwhile, though offended every morning by Frederick's remissness in writing, was free from any real anxiety about him, and had no more pressing solicitude than that of making Miss Morland's time at Northanger pass pleasantly. He often expressed his uneasiness on this head, feared the sameness of every day's society and employments would disgust her with the place, wished the Lady Frasers had been in the country, talked every now and then of having a large party to dinner, and once or twice began even to calculate the number of young dancing people in the neighborhood. But then it was such a dead time of year, no wildfowl, no game, and the Lady Frasers were not in the country. And it all ended at last in his telling Henry one morning that when he next went to Woodston they would take him by surprise there some day or other and eat their mutton with him. Henry was greatly honored and very happy, and Catherine was quite delighted with the scheme. "And when do you think, sir, I may look forward to this pleasure? I must be at Woodston on Monday to attend the parish meeting, and shall probably be obliged to stay 2 or 3 days." "Well, well, we will take our chance some one of those days. There is no need to fix. You are not to put yourself at all out of your way. Whatever you may happen to have in the house will be enough. I think I can answer for the young ladies making allowance for a bachelor's table. Let me see. Monday will be a busy day with you. We will not come on Monday, and Tuesday will be a busy one with me. I expect my surveyor from Brockham with his report in the morning, and afterwards I cannot in decency fail attending the club. I really could not face my acquaintance if I stayed away now, for, as I am known to be in the country, it would be taken exceedingly amiss, and it is a rule with me, Miss Morland, never to give offence to any of my neighbours, if a small sacrifice of time and attention can prevent it. They are a set of very worthy men. They have half a buck from Northanger twice a year, and I dine with them whenever I can. Tuesday, therefore, we may say is out of the question. But on Wednesday, I think, Henry, you may expect us, and we shall be with you early, that we may have time to look about us. 2 hours and 3/4 will carry us to Woodston, I suppose. We shall be in the carriage by 10, so about 1/4 before 1 on Wednesday you may look for us." A ball itself could not have been more welcome to Catherine than this little excursion. So strong was her desire to be acquainted with Woodston, and her heart was still bounding with joy when Henry, about an hour afterwards, came booted and greatcoated into the room where she and Elinor were sitting, and said, "I am come, young ladies, in a very moralizing strain, to observe that our pleasures in this world are always to be paid for, and that we often purchase them at a great disadvantage, giving ready-moneyed actual happiness for a draught on the future that may not be honored. Witness myself at this present hour, because I am to hope for the satisfaction of seeing you at Woodston on Wednesday, which bad weather or 20 other causes may prevent, I must go away directly, 2 days before I intended it." "Go away?" said Catherine, with a very long face. "And why?" "Why? How can you ask the question? Because no time is to be lost in frightening my old housekeeper out of her wits, because I must go and prepare a dinner for you, to be sure." "Oh, not seriously?" "Aye, and sadly too, for I had much rather stay." "But how can you think of such a thing, after what the General said, when he so particularly desired you not to give yourself any trouble, because anything would do?" Henry only smiled. "I am sure it is quite unnecessary upon your sister's account and mine. You must know it to be so, and the General made such a point of your providing nothing extraordinary. Besides, if he had not said half so much as he did, he has always such an excellent dinner at home, that sitting down to a middling one for 1 day could not signify." "I wish I could reason like you, for his sake and my own. Good-bye. As tomorrow is Sunday, Elinor, I shall not return." He went, and, it being at any time a much simpler operation to Catherine to doubt her own judgment than Henry's, she was very soon obliged to give him credit for being right, however disagreeable to her his going. But the inexplicability of the General's conduct dwelt much on her thoughts. That he was very particular in his eating she had, by her own unassisted observation, already discovered. But why he should say one thing so positively and mean another all the while was most unaccountable. How were people at that rate to be understood? Who but Henry could have been aware of what his father was at? From Saturday to Wednesday, however, they were now to be without Henry. This was the sad finale of every reflection, and Captain Tilney's letter would certainly come in his absence, and Wednesday she was very sure would be wet. The past, present, and future were all equally in gloom. Her brother so unhappy, and her loss in Isabella so great, and Elinor's spirits always affected by Henry's absence. What was there to interest or amuse her? She was tired of the woods and the shrubberies, always so smooth and so dry, and the Abbey in itself was no more to her now than any other house. The painful remembrance of the folly it had helped to nourish and perfect was the only emotion which could spring from a consideration of the building. What a revolution in her ideas! She, who had so longed to be in an abbey! Now there was nothing so charming to her imagination as the unpretending comfort of a well-connected parsonage, something like Fullerton, but better. Fullerton had its faults, but Woodston probably had none. If Wednesday should ever come! It did come, and exactly when might be reasonably looked for. It came, it was fine, and Catherine trod on air. By 10 o'clock the chaise and 4 conveyed the two from the Abbey, and after an agreeable drive of almost 20 miles, they entered Woodston, a huge and populous village, in a situation not unpleasant. Catherine was ashamed to say how pretty she thought it, as the General seemed to think an apology necessary for the flatness of the country and the size of the village. But in her heart she preferred it to any place she had ever been at, and looked with great admiration at every neat house above the rank of a cottage, and at all the little chandlers' shops which they passed. At the further end of the village, and tolerably disengaged from the rest of it, stood the parsonage. A new-built substantial stone house, with its semicircular sweep and green gates. and as they drove up to the door, Henry, with the friends of his solitude, a large Newfoundland puppy and 2 or 3 terriers, was ready to receive and make much of them. Catherine's mind was too full as she entered the house for her either to observe or to say a great deal, and till called on by the General for her opinion of it, she had very little idea of the room in which she was sitting. Upon looking round it then, she perceived in a moment that it was the most comfortable room in the world, but she was too guarded to say so, and the coldness of her praise disappointed him. "We are not calling it a good house," said he. "We are not comparing it with Fullerton and Northanger. We are considering it a mere parsonage, small and confined, we allow, but decent, perhaps, and habitable, and altogether not inferior to the generality. Or, in other words, I believe there are few country parsonages in England half so good. It may admit of improvement, however. Far be it from me to say otherwise, and anything in reason, a bow thrown out, perhaps, though between ourselves, if there is one thing more than another my aversion, it is a patched-on bow." Catherine did not hear enough of this speech to understand or be pained by it, and other subjects being studiously brought forward and supported by Henry, at the same time that a tray full of refreshments was introduced by his servant, the General was shortly restored to his complacency, and Catherine to all her usual ease of spirits. The room in question was of a commodious, well-proportioned size, and handsomely fitted up as a dining parlour, and on their quitting it to walk around the grounds, she was shown first into a smaller apartment belonging peculiarly to the master of the house, and made unusually tidy on the occasion, and afterwards into what was to be the drawing-room, with the appearance of which, though unfurnished, Catherine was delighted enough even to satisfy the General. It was a prettily shaped room, the windows reaching to the ground, and the view from them pleasant, though only over green meadows, and she expressed her admiration at the moment with all the honest simplicity with which she felt it. "Oh, why do you not fit up this room, Mr. Tilney? What a pity not to have it fitted up! It is the prettiest room I ever saw. It is the prettiest room in the world." "I trust," said the General, with a most satisfied smile, "that it will very speedily be furnished. It waits only for a lady's taste." "Well, if it was my house, I should never sit anywhere else. Oh, what a sweet little cottage there is among the trees! Apple trees, too. It is the prettiest cottage." "You like it. You approve it as an object. It is enough. Henry, remember that Robinson is spoken to about it. The cottage remains." Such a compliment recalled all Catherine's consciousness and silenced her directly, and though pointedly applied to by the General for her choice of the prevailing colour of the paper and hangings, nothing like an opinion on the subject could be drawn from her. The influence of fresh objects and fresh air, however, was of great use in dissipating these embarrassing associations, and having reached the ornamental part of the premises, consisting of a walk round 2 sides of a meadow, on which Henry's genius had begun to act about half a year ago, she was sufficiently recovered to think it prettier than any pleasure ground she had ever been in before, though there was not a shrub in it higher than the green bench in the corner. A saunter into other meadows and through part of the village, with a visit to the stables to examine some improvements, and a charming game of play with a litter of puppies just able to roll about, brought them to 4 o'clock, when Catherine scarcely thought it could be 3. At 4 they were to dine, and at 6 to set off on their return. Never had any day passed so quickly. She could not but observe that the abundance of the dinner did not seem to create the smallest astonishment in the General, nay, that he was even looking at the side table for cold meat which was not there. His son and daughter's observations were of a different kind. They had seldom seen him eat so heartily at any table but his own, and never before known him so little disconcerted by the melted butters being oiled. At 6 o'clock, the General having taken his coffee, the carriage again received them, and so gratifying had been the tenor of his conduct throughout the whole visit, so well assured was her mind on the subject of his expectations, that, Could she have felt equally confident of the wishes of his son, Catherine would have quitted Woodston with little anxiety as to the how or the when she might return to it. End of chapter 26. Recorded by Beth Dudek. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 27. The next morning brought the following very unexpected letter from Isabella. Bath, April. My dearest Catherine, I received your 2 kind letters with the greatest delight, and have 1,000 apologies to make for not answering them sooner. I really am quite ashamed of my idleness, but in this horrid place one can find time for nothing. I have had my pen in my hand to begin a letter to you almost every day since you left Bath, but have always been prevented by some silly trifler or other. Pray write to me soon, and direct to my own home. Thank God we leave this vile place tomorrow. Since you went away I have had no pleasure in it. The dust is beyond anything, and everybody one cares for is gone. I believe if I could see you I should not mind the rest, for you are dearer to me than anybody can conceive. I am quite uneasy about your dear brother, not having heard from him since he went to Oxford, and am fearful of some misunderstanding. Your kind offices will set all right. He is the only man I ever did or could love, and I trust you will convince him of it. The spring fashions are partly down, and the hats the most frightful you can imagine. I hope you spend your time pleasantly, but am afraid you never think of me. I will not say all that I could of the family you are with, because I would not be ungenerous or set you against those you esteem. But it is very difficult to know whom to trust, and young men never know their minds 2 days together. I rejoice to say that the young man whom, of all others, I particularly abhor, has left Bath. You will know from this description I must mean Captain Tilney, who, as you may remember, was amazingly disposed to follow and tease me before you went away. Afterwards he got worse, and became quite my shadow. Many girls might have been taken in, for never were such attentions. But I knew the fickle sex too well. He went away to his regiment 2 days ago, and I trust I shall never be plagued with him again. He is the greatest coxcomb I ever saw, and amazingly disagreeable. The last 2 days he was always by the side of Charlotte Davis. I pitied his taste, but took no notice of him. The last time we met was in Bath Street, and I turned directly into a shop that he might not speak to me. I would not even look at him. He went into the pump-room afterwards, but I would not have followed him for all the world. Such a contrast between him and your brother. Pray send me some news of the latter. I am quite unhappy about him. He seemed so uncomfortable when he went away with a cold or something that affected his spirits. I would write to him myself, but have mislaid his direction, and as I hinted above, am afraid he took something in my conduct amiss. Pray explain everything to his satisfaction, or, if he still harbours any doubt, a line from himself to me, or a call at Putney when next in town might set all to rights. I have not been to the rooms this age, nor to the play, except going in last night with the Hodges for a frolic at half price. They teased me into it, and I was determined they should not say I shut myself up because Tilney was gone. We happened to sit by the Mitchells, and they pretended to be quite surprised to see me out. I knew their spite. At one time they could not be civil to me, but now they are all friendship. But I am not such a fool as to be taken in by them. You know I have a pretty good spirit of my own. Anne Mitchell had tried to put on a turban like mine, as I wore it the week before at the concert, but made wretched work of it. It happened to become my odd face, I believe. At least Tilney told me so at the time, and said every eye was upon me. But he is the last man whose word I would take. I wear nothing but purple now. I know I look hideous in it, but no matter, it is your dear brother's favourite colour. Lose no time, my dearest, sweetest Catherine, in writing to him and to me, whoever am, etc. Such a strain of shallow artifice could not impose even upon Catherine. Its inconsistencies, contradictions, and falsehoods struck her from the very first. She was ashamed of Isabella, and ashamed of having ever loved her. Her professions of attachment were now as disgusting as her excuses were empty, and her demands impudent. Write to James on her behalf? No, James should never hear Isabella's name mentioned by her again. On Henry's arrival from Woodston, she made known to him and Eleanor their brother's safety, congratulating them with sincerity on it, and reading aloud the most material passages of her letter with strong indignation. When she had finished it, "So much for Isabella," she cried, "and for all our intimacy. She must think me an idiot, or she could not have written so. But perhaps this has served to make her character better known to me than mine is to her. I see what she has been about. She is a vain coquette, and her tricks have not answered. I do not believe she had ever any regard either for James or for me, and I wish I had never known her." "It will soon be as if you never had," said Henry. "There is but one thing that I cannot understand. I see that she has had designs on Captain Tilney which have not succeeded, but I do not understand what Captain Tilney has been about all this time. Why should he pay her such attentions as to make her quarrel with my brother and then fly off himself? I have very little to say for Frederick's motives, such as I believe them to have been. He has his vanities as well as Miss Thorpe, and the chief difference is, that, having a stronger head, they have not yet injured himself. If the effect of his behavior does not justify him with you, we had better not seek after the cause." "Then you do not suppose he ever really cared about her?" "I am persuaded that he never did." "And only made believe to do so for mischief's sake?" Henry bowed his assent. "Well, then, I must say that I do not like him at all. Though it has turned out so well for us, I do not like him at all. As it happens, there is no great harm done, because I do not think Isabella has any heart to lose. But suppose he had made her very much in love with him?" "But we must first suppose Isabella to have had a heart to lose, consequently to have been a very different creature, and in that case she would have met with very different treatment." "It is very right that you should stand by your brother." "And if you would stand by yours, you would not much be distressed by the disappointment of Miss Thorpe. But your mind is warped by an innate principle of general integrity, and therefore not accessible to the cool reasonings of family partiality or a desire of revenge." Catherine was complimented out of further bitterness. Frederick could not be unpardonably guilty, while Henry made himself so agreeable. She resolved on not answering Isabella's letter, and tried to think no more of it. End of chapter 27.